There's a core security argument that has failed the American people, that globe-spanning dominance makes Americans safe. I think it makes them less safe. I think it creates enemies, antagonisms, and leaves us pretty helpless against the threats of the 21st century, as we see in the midst of the pandemic.
That's the voice of Dr. Stephen Wertheim, Deputy Director of Research and Policy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University, and author of the new book, Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button. This week we have some pretty big news.
That is right, Michelle. This weekend, Honduras became the 50th country to ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, also known as the Nuclear Ban Treaty.
This means that after a 90-day waiting period, the use, threat of use, development, testing, production, and possession of nuclear weapons will be prohibited under international law for the first time in history. This 90-day period ends on January 22nd, just a few days after Inauguration Day. So this is a really big deal.
Even though none of the nuclear-armed states, including the United States, have ratified or signed the ban treaty, I still think over time that international legal prohibition will have a symbolic and political impact. I mean, after all, this is how things started with the chemical weapons ban and the biological weapons ban, which are now widely accepted treaties.
Yeah, that's right, Tom. And the entry into force of this treaty is a milestone accomplishment and will have, I think, really important consequences for shifting the conversation around nuclear weapons. If you'd like to hear more about the ban treaty and what it means for nuclear politics, you should go back and listen to an interview that Tom had with Beatrice Finn, the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, also known as ICAN, who accepted the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the coalition that advocated for the ban treaty. But back to today's episode. Tom, what do you have lined up for early warning?
Well, Michelle, as you may have seen, North Korea and the New START Treaty are back in the news after last week's presidential debate and the continuing back and forth between Washington and Moscow over the future of New START, which is set to expire in February. And we break this down and what happened and what it means on early warning.
Afterwards, I sit down with Dr. Stephen Wertheim, who's at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, to talk about his new book, Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, which comes out today. Stephen makes the argument that the U.S.'s transformation into a global superpower in the years after World War II required an unprecedented and so far not reversed break in the way that the U.S. saw its place in the world. He explains how American leaders made this shift, why they haven't looked back, and what it means for U.S. power now and in the decades ahead. It's a great conversation, and be sure to check out his new book, available today on Amazon.
And finally, Michelle answers a Halloween-themed question on radiation and zombies on this week's Q&A segment. I can't wait to hear it. Remember, if you want your question answered on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod, or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org. We can't wait to hear from you.
And as always, please click the subscribe button and give us a rating. We do this podcast for you. With that said, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thank you, Del. Last week, North Korea and New START were in the news. And to help us understand what happened, we have two excellent guests. Jessica Lee is a senior research fellow in the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute. And Shannon Bugos is a research associate at the Arms Control Association, focusing on New START. Jess, let's start with you. In last week's presidential debate, only one question was asked about nuclear weapons, and it was on North Korea. President Trump was forced to defend his photo op diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, saying he had prevented a war. And Vice President Biden said he would meet with Kim only if Kim agreed in advance to scale back its nuclear program. So first question for you, Jess, how do you grade the Trump administration on North Korea? I mean, was Trump right to engage? And did he have a plan for success?
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be with you today. I would give the Trump administration a B- for its efforts. I mean, I think, President Trump, does deserve some credit for doing what no sitting American president has ever done before, which is to meet with the North Korean leader. And as you know, prior to the Trump-Kim summits, the highest level meeting between the United States and North Korean officials was back in October 2000, when then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright visited North Korea to personally meet with Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il. So it's been almost 20 years since we had this level of exchange between the two countries. And I think President Trump was guided by the right instincts. I think he sees that Americans don't want open-ended conflicts. Peace and diplomacy protect U.S. national security interests far better than endless war. And I think senior diplomats like Steve Biegun genuinely sought to make progress and really make a historic move toward a different type of relationship and a more peaceful Korean peninsula. I think the problem is President Trump ultimately took the side of political operatives. And we saw what happened in the Hanoi summit in February 2019, where U.S. declined the offer by North Korea to shut down a key nuclear facility at Yongbyon. So, I agree with Dr. Sig Hecker, who noted that, as we read about this in Bob Woodward's book, Rage, that this was a missed opportunity. This was a golden chance, for United States to make progress on the nuclear issue. So, I guess the bottom line is it's unclear what President Trump would do to make more progress, both on the nuclear issue, but, on the broader goals of the Singapore Declaration that he signed with Kim Jong-un 2 years ago.
Thanks. And second, if Vice President Biden wins, how the election, that is, how do you think he should handle North Korea? And is it realistic, as he said in the debate, to set conditions on talks?
Well, I think Vice President Biden, has to be careful, not to dismiss the Trump Kim diplomacy and the efforts of the recent years as downright failure. I don't think it was a failure, but I think Vice President Biden is making a broader point, which is if we're going to go down this path of diplomacy, we need to have a plan. And we need to have working level talks and some sort of a general agreement about how we're getting there before we declare anything. So I'm with General Robert Abrams, commander of USFK, U.S. Forces Korea, who said that, not having reliable information about North Korea, whether it's the nuclear capabilities or what's going on inside in this COVID world, is a national security threat for the United States. So I think the United States has to make more progress. And the way we can do that, either in a second Trump term or in a Biden administration, would be to look at past agreements, right? The September 2005 joint statement of the six party talks is a good one, in which we had actually explicitly recognized Pyongyang's sovereignty and right to exist. And I think that kind of peace-related concession and political agreement would do a lot to help us make more progress on the nuclear front.
Thank you. And now, Shannon, turning to you, last week, the Trump administration told us it was very, very close to a deal with Russia to extend New START for 1 year. But once again, Russia saw the situation very differently, with a senior official saying that the Trump administration was unwilling to make an agreement on New START, despite its public statements. So, Shannon, give us your sense. Were the two sides ever that close to a deal last week, as the Trump administration said they were? And if not, Why is the administration hyping the prospects?
Thanks, Tom. So not quite, certainly not as close as some officials from the Trump administration would like you to believe. So for context, both the United States and Russia have recently made a proposal about extending New START. So the Trump administration proposed a 1-year extension paired with a 1-year freeze on all US and Russian nuclear warheads, plus some type of verification regime on that freeze. Russia has since proposed a 1-year extension of New START and a 1-year freeze that would be willing to undertake a commitment to that freeze. But missing from what I just said about the Russian offer is any verification. Moscow has not agreed to any verification measures right now, particularly the ones, it seems, that the Trump administration has put forward. And that is a pretty big piece to disagree on. So verification is complex, and figuring it out would involve tough, time-consuming discussions on things like stockpile declarations, counting rules, and monitoring and inspections processes. Nevertheless, we've seen from the Trump administration headlines claiming that a deal is very close at hand, when the reality is that a lot of work is to be done before any deal could come together. So as for why the Trump administration has been hyping it up, it could be them wanting to try and score what they would try to call a foreign policy win for Trump ahead of the presidential election, to try to claim some sort of quote unquote progress or a deal. Or the administration could be doing this in order to try and save face, claiming that they offered Russia a deal, Moscow rejected it, and whatever happens next, potentially an arms race, is not on the United States. Remember, New START is the last treaty limiting US and Russian nuclear arsenals, and if it expires in February, the two countries would be without any limits on their arsenals for the first time since 1972. And lastly, the Trump administration could also be doing this because it doesn't really want to reach a deal and extend New START. Officials have not been quiet about their criticisms of New START, and they didn't even begin more serious dialogue about extending the treaty until Special Presidential Envoy for Arms Control Marshall Billingsley came on board this past April.
Thanks. Assuming they do not reach a deal before the election, do you expect Trump to keep trying, or do you expect this to carry over into the next administration?
So that's all a little bit of a mystery. So depending upon what happens November 3rd, so Biden has said that if he wins, he would pursue an extension of New START. So if he wins, Billingsley has not necessarily counted out trying to continue talks with Russia on some type of deal before January. He also tried to claim, and I would disagree, that Russia agreeing to this deal in principle sets the bar higher for any future administration, and that the Biden administration would have to rethink its approach. This all also depends on what Moscow's reaction would be, whether they would want to wait out the Trump admin for a Biden admin. If Trump wins, Billingsley could keep trying to reach a deal or not under a second Trump administration. As I said before, there's an argument to be made that the Trump administration doesn't really want to extend New START anyways. And Billingsley has said just a couple of weeks ago that the price for Russia to extend New START would go up after the election.
Thank you. There is the siren. Would love to keep chatting about these issues, but we are out of time. Shannon and Jess, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Dr. Stephen Wertheim is Deputy Director of Research and Policy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. His writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Review of Books, the Washington Post, and most recently, the New York Times. He is the author of the newly released book, Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy. Stephen, congratulations on your new book and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Let's get straight into it. The heart of your book is about how the United States made a choice 80 years ago to not only pursue military supremacy, but also to sustain it long into the future. One of the very first things you do is flip this traditional narrative of isolationists versus internationalists on its head. You say that it wasn't that internationalists shoved aside isolationists in the years around the Second World War, but that the old internationalists found themselves labeled isolationists by those who favored American military supremacy in foreign affairs. This was a really interesting idea for me that seemed to fly in the face of many of the things I learned in my high school history classes and international relations courses. So what do you mean by this?
I was surprised too. So we have to get it out of our minds that there was ever a group of Americans who favored isolationism. They simply didn't exist. Almost no one has ever used the term to describe themselves. The term emerged only in the ism emerged only in the 1930s and 40s. And when it did, and ever since, it was deployed as an epithet to win a political argument, and to win that argument precisely by mischaracterizing opponents of the use of force as people who wanted the United States to have no contact with the outside world, which again describes basically nobody. So this means that for all of American history from the founding to the 1930s, no Americans found it useful to think of America as isolationist or even to accuse others of being isolationists. So that means, if we deploy this category, as many scholars have done, to understand the United States and its foreign relations, we're doing something ahistorical. So how can we properly understand America's role in the world prior to the 1930s? So at the time, the question that Americans debated was, how should the United States be part of the world? What kind of internationalism and nationalism should there be? And there was a broad consensus that the United States should avoid entering into military entanglements in Europe and Asia, in the corrupt old world. The question was how the United States should lead the new world and either avoid or seek to overcome the system of power politics rooted in the old world. And that traditional nationalist and internationalist position seemed to rule out the option of dominating power politics by force, as Americans in the 19th century would complain that Great Britain had done. So it was only at a particular point that this changed.
So then, still looking at the history, how do the American imperial projects in the Caribbean, in Asia, at the turn of the century play into this, if this came before this switch to this frame of military supremacy?
To be clear, the United States relentlessly expanded its power from the very beginning. It conquered territory across North America to create the logo map of the United States that we know today. It incorporated that territory into the federal union. Thomas Jefferson called this pattern of conquest an empire of and for liberty. And then in 1898, the United States became an indisputable colonial power. It took Puerto Rico and the Philippines from Spain and ruled them without bringing them into the Union. So no doubt about it, the United States was an empire, and a significant empire. I mean, ruling the Philippines, millions of people for 48 years, that's a big thing. The United States was a significant colonial power. What this history shows is that even as the United States ruled out entanglements in the so-called old world, it gave itself license to expand and police the so-called new world, and even part of the Far East. So it's for good reason that a lot of historians narrate U.S. foreign policy as a story of untrammeled expansion. And that's part of the reason, though, why the book that I wanted to write hadn't been written, because if you see the United States is just constantly expanding for whatever reason, maybe you think it's capitalism, maybe you think it's the ideology of exceptionalism, you miss the idea that there did have to be a rupture for the new world, old world dichotomy to be fundamentally breached, and for Americans to imagine that their world role was actually global military hegemony. That rupture had to be undertaken. And even American exceptionalism, which is something that critics of foreign policy spend a lot of time understanding, and it is important in my story, exceptionalism could cut either way on American intervention. There was always an argument that exceptionalists could make that the United States was a unique experiment that first and foremost had to maintain its distinctiveness by not getting entangled, not being sullied and corrupted by others in the world. And so that position was an extremely powerful position for those who were opposed to intervention in World War II initially, before Pearl Harbor. There were exceptionalists on one side of the question. Then there were exceptionalists on the other side of the question who started to make the argument that for the United States to be a world historical force, to truly make good on its historic aspiration to be a model to the world and to see the world move generally along American lines in the new circumstances of the mid 20th century, with totalitarianism stalking the globe, the United States needed to take up arms and impose its way of ordering the world by force.
So when we talk about this rupture and this change between this old internationalism and new internationalism and how that gets entwined with this idea of American primacy, it is a fundamental shift, but you point out that it feels less transformational today because we as Americans have become so used to the practice of primacy that we almost don't even see it anymore. Can you describe some of the assumptions behind that primacy that makes it feel so natural, and how do we see it play out in the world today?
So no sooner was American primacy conceived than the people conceiving it tried to obscure the difficult decision that they were making. They tried to make American supremacy seem natural, first and foremost to Americans. Henry Luce, the publishing mogul, took to his own pages in Life magazine in February of 1941 in his famous essay announcing the arrival of the American century. This is before Pearl Harbor. And he writes that we can make a truly American internationalism as natural to us in our own time as the airplane or the radio. He's laying it out for everyone, including the public. We're going to make this seem natural to you. Now, just because some elites tried to legitimate their choices and, represent dominance or isolationism as the only alternatives, that doesn't mean that their choices were necessarily wrong. And the original rationale for primacy had a cohesive logic to it. It was meant to prevent totalitarian powers from dominating the industrial heartlands of the world in Europe and Asia. And in the wake of the fall of France, this stunning event that nobody expected, including Hitler's own generals, the fall of France to Nazi Germany in the middle of 1940, it was a real possibility that the Axis powers were going to achieve a dominance in Europe and Asia and come to lead what they were then calling the New Order in Europe and Asia. And then Soviet-backed communism posed a similar kind of threat, different kind of totalitarian power later on in the 1940s. I certainly think the United States should have defeated the Axis powers and counterbalanced Soviet power as well. Possibly with better statecraft and different circumstances, the U.S.-Soviet conflict could have been less intense from the beginning, but that's a whole set of questions for historians to deal with. Here's the problem, though, for us, I think. Primacy was conceived as a near perpetual project meant to outlast any specific adversaries. So in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed completely. Totalitarian conquerors disappeared from the earth, and yet the United States responded by making a bid for more complete dominance than ever before. And that decision makes sense. It is explicable given the decisions that it had made and internalized earlier. Unfortunately, the effects are all around us today. The United States has acquired more and more enemies around the world, which don't necessarily need to threaten the United States behind its oceans. But when the United States scatters its forces all around the world, well, those adversaries do threaten American forces and the interests that the United States has acquired in maintaining its own dominance. We've seen endless wars across the greater Middle East. We've seen hatreds unleashed by the endless wars turned inward against immigrants, against political opponents, possibly against democracy itself. And the United States lavishes $1 trillion on national security. that overwhelmingly goes to combating military threats. Meanwhile, the American people, we're cooped up in our living rooms right now. The American people are experiencing 9/11 scale death every 3 days and rising from a virus against which our military preeminence is helpless. So, if only we had the kind of creative thinking responsive to current environment, or current threats that American foreign policy elites produced in World War II, even though I'm critical of some of the decisions, the long-term decisions set in place then.
Before we get to the current moment, because I really want to hear what you think we should be doing and what an alternative policy would be, going back to this concept of primacy, I think it's really interesting that as you lay it out and describe it, it's not just about the desire to have the biggest military or guarding America alone, but that you have to be stationed abroad and you have to be willing to use force routinely, preferably on a modest scale, in order to continually demonstrate that power. And so it becomes almost a self-feeding machine with no end in sight.
Yeah, self-licking ice cream cone is perhaps a pleasurable metaphor. That's certainly what it's become. But of course, at the inception, the U.S. military wasn't that powerful. It was an important interest, but I don't think that the original decision was nearly as determined by what we might call the military-industrial complex today. So that's why I take the ideas seriously. Primacy has been conceived by a number of scholars in the post-Cold War era who've developed a paradigm in the academy called restraint. And so just kind of naming primacy for what it is a really helpful thing as part of that project. And it's been an inspiration for me. But my view of primacy really comes from the historical work that I've done. And I think what I think is at the foundation of primacy and the decision that American foreign policy makers made in 1940 and 41 is a redefinition of America's vital interests in the world and its responsibilities. In other words, these are the things that would justify the commitment and use of military force as if they are grave threats to the American people. And that redefinition took place in order to make the United States, in principle, responsible for defining world order by force. And anything else was cast as isolationism. And the troubling thing about this, and I think the reason why it's so skewed our foreign policy making and debate today, is that even those who made this decision did not, in fact, think that an Axis victory, however tragic and terrible, in Europe would actually lead to an invasion of the United States. They recognized that the United States, behind its oceans at that time, was quite secure. And if we add its nuclear deterrent today, that argument continues to hold, but it held even before that. And they also calculated, as I show in the book, planners in the Council on Foreign Relations calculated that the U.S. economy actually did not depend much on foreign trade, especially after the Great Depression. And so they made an argument that was quite vague in their own time, that, the United States had this vital interest and responsibility in preventing world order generally from being overtaken or defined by totalitarian powers. Now, I can't help but sympathize with that point of view, looking back. At the time, it was extremely controversial, and Americans who were opposed to U.S. intervention initially in the war before Pearl Harbor pointed out that there's no vital interest here. The United States is secure in North America. It should guard the entire Western Hemisphere. Isolationism, this was not. Guard the entire Western Hemisphere, but go no further than that. And so I think the challenge is that, what was justified against the Axis powers becomes progressively less justified, such that in our own time, H.R. McMaster is warning just the other day that, appeasement of the Taliban, if we end the war in Afghanistan, would be like, Munich again, which is just, frankly, it's insulting to the integrity of the very architects of American primacy, who wouldn't have been that crude, who understood the decision they were making. And to your last point, I mean, you're right. It's pretty clear from the archival documents that one reason why American planners were reluctant to make this choice through so much of American history is that they recognized the United States, once it embarked on this mission to be responsible for the fate of the world using military force, who knew what consequences that would have for the United States? Who knew how much expenditure would be required and where Americans would be deployed around the world? They understood that what they were planning was, as one of them put it, essentially offensive in character. And they looked at the British imperial experience as a model for the kind of routine armed policing of the world that they expected the United States to undertake, initially in partnership with Britain, which hopefully would be low intensity warfare, but would be something like what we would call endless war.
So then, going back to the present day, as you call out in your New York Times op-ed, this status quo is being challenged, whether it's the wars in the Middle East, the militarized violence in American streets, and at the same time, politicians are going to be facing pressure to demonstrate fiscal restraint after all of our spending this year. And the defense budget is a ripe target. I mean, the defense contractors have just released their budgets for next year showing almost no growth. And so do you think this confluence of events will be enough to create change? And if so, what would change look like?
Well, we don't know, but we do know that we're undergoing a significant change. We are actually leaving, I think, a 3-decade period of historic demobilization, depoliticization of American foreign policy. But we can look at the last decade plus and see that there are significant stirrings. I mean, we've seen policy progress in areas that initially seemed potentially impossible. The JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. Congress has stepped up and demanded that the United States end its support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. We may see that in a future administration come to pass. And I do think the war in Afghanistan, it's not clear what will happen. The current president has had 4 years, a lot of talk about ending the war. We're just getting the troop levels now below the level that he inherited. But I do think it may well be on a path to ending. And politically, our last two presidents, both surprising presidents, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, I'm not sure they win their primary battles, but for their stances against the Iraq war. At least these were anti-war stances relative to their opponents. So the public is ready for change, more ready than the elites are in Washington. And that's part of the reason that the Quincy Institute exists, and for the buildup of a restraint-oriented community in Washington, D.C. So there needs to be a lot of change at the elite level in order for popular mobilization to have effect. I think a couple things on a more practical note need to be done. We need, as a country, as a society, for people who are not directly involved in the foreign policy conversation to have a little more confidence, think about, the arguments being made, and join together and make connections. So if you are exercised about the threat of climate change, I do not see how we can do a Green New Deal in the United States, but if China, which is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, doesn't reduce its emissions, this is a planetary threat. And if the United States gets into a Cold War with China, which is exactly the path that we seem to be headed down, I don't see how that redounds to greater cooperation to decarbonize the economies of both countries and rally the world, provide low-cost green technologies to the world that will help to alleviate the worst effects of climate change. We've got to make that connection. And if you want smaller government, military socialism should not be your friend, as many allies among libertarians and conservatives understand. So I would wager that the vast majority of Americans think that whatever possible good the United States might hypothetically do, projecting its armed force permanently around the globe as we look forward in the 21st century, it's just outweighed by our urgent needs at home. And so I think there are strong prospects now for enterprising politicians. People running for Congress know where their constituents are, and whether they're on the left or the right or even in the center, they are striking a very different tone today than they had in the past. And so I think we have the opportunity to form a transpartisan coalition, just as the consensus around U.S. global military dominance has a transpartisan or bipartisan coalition around it, even as people disagree on some very important issues. That's fine. But, there's a core security argument that has failed the American people, that globe-spanning dominance makes Americans safe. I think it makes them less safe. I think it creates enemies, antagonisms, and leaves us pretty helpless against the threats of the 21st century, as we see in the midst of the pandemic. And I'll say one last thing. It might just be more likely today that a restrained U.S. foreign policy might win in the future than it looked as of the start of World War II for armed primacy to win out.
Stephen, thank you so much for joining. Before we go, where can interested listeners go to get a copy of your book?
Oh my, what a question. Well, there's a store called Amazon.com, and, it's available there. The book is published by Harvard University Press, so you can order it directly from there. And I think on my own website, if you Google my name, I have a directory. So if you're an international listener or you want to look at independent bookshops, you can Google my name, click on book, and you'll get some instructions.
Thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Farshad Farahat. I'm an Iranian-American writer and actor and a member of the Plowshares Fund Board of Directors. Join me on Monday, November 2nd for Unmute Yourself, a Zoom happy hour series hosted by Plowshares Fund. Stephen Miles from Win Without War, Cassandra Vranka from Foreign Policy for America, and myself will be talking about militarization and the impacts of this political process on our relationships here at home and abroad. This is the most important election of our lifetime. The future of a foreign policy grounded in your priorities and your values hangs in the balance. So grab a drink and join us, Monday, November 2nd, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. You could register at plowshares.org.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now everyone's favorite nuclear Q&A segment. This week's properly Halloween-themed question comes from Lisa in Vermont. Hi, Lisa in Vermont. I'm in New Hampshire, waving hello. Lisa asks, I feel like I've seen a bunch of horror movies over the years where nuclear leaks or spills create radioactive zombies that feed on brains. Lisa, I know what you mean. I know it's just a movie trope, but is there any science behind it? Could radiation do something like that to a person's body? All right, Michelle, what do you think?
Thanks, Lisa. It's a really good question, and there is a whole world of literature out there on radiation in our stories and in our psychology. So first of all, radiation will not turn you into a zombie. And I know your question was asked in jest, but it's actually quite serious. What it will do to the human body. In terms of the actual effects, there are different types of radiation, which will affect tissues and bones differently, and you have to protect yourself in different ways. You can sometimes protect yourself with just a sheet of paper. Other times, depending on it, it may take, a bunch of lead or other much thicker material. But if you read firsthand accounts or secondhand accounts like John Hersey's Hiroshima, you hear about the horrific burns, the internal bleeding, skin falling off in sheets, vomiting, diarrhea, sepsis, convulsions, coma, that severe radiation poisoning can cause. If you survive the near-term dosage and it's not enough to kill you, you may have a long-term effect, cancers like leukemia. And of course, when it comes to a atomic bomb, it's not just the radiation, right, that could kill you. There's the thermal blast. There's the collapse of infrastructure around you, where if you don't have clean water, there's going to be a spread of infectious disease. So, there's a lot of effects. But I think, the other thing to keep in mind is that radiation has kind of grown into this boogeyman in our stories where you're afraid of it because it's invisible. And there's been a lot of discrimination against survivors of the blast in Japan, those who have lived in the areas in the U.S., the downwinders, where, weapons were tested. I know my own grandfather tried to dissuade my parents from moving to Eastern Washington, citing the environmental contamination and their health as a reason not to go. And I think the final piece is there's this big question mark of, the U.S. government hasn't done a lot of the studies or research over time. Data is political. Data is power. And so not tracking closely what some of the health effects are, what it's done to populations here or abroad has obscured the reality. It's made it more difficult for us to know what the actual impacts have been, and it's left us more afraid and less empowered. So will it turn you into a zombie? No, but I highly recommend that you're very careful around whichever radiation sources you may come in contact with.
Another week, another question. Thank you, Michelle. And remember, if you would like to get your question on the air, tweet or DM us at Press Button Pod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.